November 1941, El Agila, Libya. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the barren landscape as the convoy of trucks came to a dusty halt. The German soldier stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft, powdery sand. He paused, taking in the sight before him. It was as if he had landed on another planet. The desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, a sea of shifting dunes under a sky that was turning from deep blue to a fiery orange. After setting up camp, the soldier took a moment to write a quick letter home. He tried to describe the scene, but words failed him. How could he capture the eerie silence of the desert, the way the stars seemed to hang closer to the earth, or the strange beauty of the sand dunes glowing in the moonlight? He settled for a simple line: "This place is like nothing I have ever seen. It is both beautiful and terrifying." Arrival in the desert. That night, they sat around small campfires, sharing stories and trying to find comfort in each other's company. The soldier listened as an older comrade spoke about their mission. They were to drive the British out of North Africa to secure the oil-rich lands for the Reich. It sounded straightforward when put like that, but as the flames flickered and the cold desert night closed in, the soldier felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. Panic surged through him as the order to take cover was shouted. He threw himself behind a rocky outcrop, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The sound of machine guns erupted, deafening in the stillness of the desert. Dust and sand kicked up around him as bullets zipped overhead. He fired blindly in the direction of the tanks, feeling more like a prey than a predator. The next day, they were sent on a reconnaissance patrol near the small town of Agedabia. The soldier's heart pounded as they moved cautiously through the rocky terrain, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. Then, without warning, they spotted a column of British tanks cresting a nearby ridge. The skirmish was over in minutes, but it felt like hours. When the dust settled, two of his comrades lay motionless in the sand, their lifeless eyes staring up at the unforgiving sky. The soldier's hands were trembling as he reloaded his rifle, his mouth dry with fear. This was not how he had imagined his first taste of combat. There had been no glory, no heroics, only chaos and death. But the desert had a way of stripping away illusions. It was a place where weakness was punished swiftly and mercilessly. One afternoon, they came across a group of Bedouins nomads who seemed to glide over the sand, as if it were a paved road. The soldier watched them with a kind of awe. Here were people who had mastered this unforgiving land, who lived in harmony with it. He felt a pang of envy, wondering if they would ever learn to do the same. And then came the orders to move. They were to join the main force at Tobruk, to take part in the siege of the city that had become a symbol of defiance for the British. The soldier packed his gear, his heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. He knew that the worst was yet to come, that the desert had only just begun to test them. He wiped the sweat from his brow, already feeling the dry heat draining his energy, even as the temperature began to drop with the setting sun. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. He had heard stories of the desert's harshness, but nothing had prepared him for this feeling of being completely exposed, tiny and insignificant under the vastness of the sky. The soldier looked around at his comrades, all equally bewildered and awestruck by the alien beauty of the place. Some were laughing nervously, trying to adjust their uniforms and gear, clearly out of their element. Back in Europe, they had faced the chill of autumn rain and the green fields of France. Here, everything seemed inverted: the scorching sun, the dry air, the endless horizon. It was a new kind of battlefield, one that didn't seem to care who won or lost. They were a part of the famous Afrika Korps, the elite force led by the legendary General Rommel. The Desert Fox. There was pride in being chosen for this mission, a sense of adventure, but also an undercurrent of fear. This was the edge of the world, and they had no idea what awaited them in this desolate land. Back at camp that evening, the mood was somber. The soldier found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the sight of those bodies in the sand. He thought of his family back in Germany, of the warmth of his home, and the smell of fresh bread in the morning. It seemed so far away now, like a dream from another life. The days that followed were a blur of heat, sand, and fatigue. The sun was relentless, beating down on them with a fury that seemed almost personal. The wind was no better, whipping up blinding sandstorms that scoured their skin and left them coughing and choking. Water became a precious commodity, and the soldier learned to ration his sips, to ignore the constant, gnawing thirst that never seemed to go away. They spent their nights digging trenches and fortifications, their bodies aching from the effort. Each shovelful of sand was a reminder of the futility of their task. It felt like trying to build a fortress in the middle of the ocean. The soldier's back ached, his hands blistered and raw, but he kept digging, kept fighting the urge to give up. There were moments of respite, brief interludes when they could almost forget where they were. They joked about the heat, about how their skin was turning to leather, about the mysterious animals that left strange tracks around the camp at night. They even dared to dream about victory, about the medals they would wear and the stories they would tell when they returned home. As they marched out under the blazing sun, the soldier took one last look at the camp they had called home for these few short weeks. The wind was already erasing their footprints, as if they had never been there at all. He felt a chill run down his spine, despite the heat. The desert, he realized, was not just a place. It was an enemy, one that would not be easily conquered. December 1941. Outskirts of Tobruk, Libya. The convoy rumbled through the barren landscape, kicking up clouds of fine sand in its wake. The soldier sat in the back of the truck, his eyes squinting against the glare of the midday sun reflecting off the desert. He clutched his rifle tightly, glancing nervously at the men around him. The mood was tense, and their faces were drawn and sunburned. The stories about Tobruk had reached them long before they set out for this mission, a fortress that had withstood siege after siege, a thorn in the side of the Africa Corps. And now they were the ones tasked with removing it. The siege of Tobruk. They moved out silently, their boots crunching softly on the sand and gravel. The darkness was their ally, cloaking them as they crept closer to the British position. The soldier's heart hammered in his chest as they reached the edge of the outpost, a cluster of low, sandbagged emplacements bristling with barbed wire. He could hear the murmur of voices, the clink of metal as the defenders went about their business, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. He barely registered the chaos around him, the shouts, the screams, the flashes of gunfire. It was all a blur, a whirlwind of violence and noise. He saw a British soldier rise up in front of him, his face pale in the flare's light, and pulled the trigger without thinking. The man crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his uniform. The soldier's breath came in ragged gasps as he reloaded, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield, they received the order to advance. The plan was to launch a night assault on a British outpost that had been harassing their lines with sniper fire and mortar attacks. The soldier's stomach clenched with a mixture of fear and adrenaline as he checked his weapon and tightened his helmet strap. The tension was palpable, the air electric with anticipation. The next few days passed in a haze of monotony and terror. They huddled in their trenches, enduring the constant bombardment, the unceasing rattle of machine guns. Sleep was a rare luxury, snatched in fitful bursts whenever the guns fell silent. Food and water were rationed, the meager supplies doing little to stave off the gnawing hunger and thirst that plagued them. Every so often the order would come to launch another attack, another desperate push against the British defenses. Each time they would charge out of their trenches, only to be driven back by the withering fire of the defenders. The soldier lost track of how many times they had tried, how many men had fallen, their bodies left to bake in the sun between the lines. The attack was swift and brutal. A flare shot up into the sky, bathing the scene in an eerie, flickering light. The soldier felt a surge of adrenaline as he rushed forward, his comrades fanning out beside him. They unleashed a hail of bullets, the sharp cracks of their rifles echoing in the night. The British were caught off guard, stumbling out of their bunkers, blinking in confusion. The soldier fired again and again, his rifle bucking against his shoulder, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. One night, as he lay awake in the darkness, he heard a faint sound drifting over the sand, the distant strains of music. He sat up, listening intently. It was a harmonica, the haunting melody rising and falling in the still air. He felt a pang of homesickness, a longing for the familiar comforts of home. The soldier closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, if only for a moment. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the first signs of the siege came into view. the twisted remains of trucks and tanks, skeletons of vehicles scattered across the sand like the carcasses of some great beasts. The acrid smell of burning fuel lingered in the air, mixed with the faint, sickly sweet odor of death. The soldier swallowed hard, his mouth dry with fear and anticipation. This was a far cry from the skirmishes they had faced in the open desert. This was the real thing. And so they marched on, their shadows long and thin in the early morning light, heading towards an uncertain future. The soldier glanced at his comrades, their faces drawn and tired. They had survived Tobruk, but for how long? The desert was vast, and the war was far from over. The German forces had encircled the city, but the British defenders were well entrenched, using every building, every piece of rubble as cover. The air was filled with the constant sound of artillery, the dull thud of shells landing, the crack of rifles and machine guns. It was a cacophony that never seemed to end, a relentless symphony of destruction that wore on their nerves day and night. The soldiers' unit was assigned to one of the forward positions, a series of hastily dug trenches and makeshift bunkers just outside the city limits. The terrain was a nightmarish maze of jagged rocks and sandy gullies, offering little in the way of cover. They spent hours lying in the dirt, peering through binoculars at the British lines, trying to pick out targets among the rubble. Every now and then, a sniper's shot would ring out, sending them scrambling for cover, hearts pounding in their chests. They pushed the British back, driving them out of the outpost and into the darkness beyond. The soldier stood panting, his chest heaving, sweat trickling down his face despite the cool night air. He glanced around at his comrades, their faces grim and weary. They had taken the position, but at a cost. Several of their own lay still on the ground, their lifeless eyes staring up at the stars. The elation of victory was short-lived. As they set about securing the position, a deafening roar split the air. The British, refusing to give up so easily, had launched a counterattack. Shells began to rain down on them, exploding with brutal force, sending up plumes of sand and rock. The soldier threw himself to the ground, covering his head as the world erupted around him. The blasts were deafening, the shockwaves rattling his teeth and pounding in his ears. He felt a hand grab his shoulder, dragging him to his feet. It was his sergeant shouting something, his face smeared with dirt and blood. The soldier could barely make out the words over the din, but the message was clear: fall back. They stumbled through the darkness, dodging craters and wreckage, the ground trembling beneath their feet as the shells continued to fall. They made it back to their lines just as dawn began to break, the sky turning a pale, sickly gray. The soldier collapsed into the trench, his body aching, his mind numb with exhaustion. He stared blankly at the sandbags in front of him, the sounds of battle fading into a distant, hollow roar. They had survived, but for how long? Tobruk loomed ahead of them, defiant and unbroken. But the war waited for no one. The next day they received new orders. The British had launched a major counteroffensive, breaking through the Italian lines to the south. The Afrika Korps was to fall back and regroup, to prepare for the inevitable assault on their positions. The soldier packed his gear, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Tobruk would remain untaken, that their sacrifices had been in vain. But as the sun rose higher, the heat building in waves, the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting not just the enemy, but the land itself. The desert, with its vast emptiness and unforgiving nature, seemed determined to swallow them whole, to erase them from its endless sands. As they retreated through the desolate landscape, the soldier glanced back at the city, its silhouette stark against the morning sky. He felt a surge of anger and frustration, a bitter taste in his mouth. They had come so close, and yet it had slipped through their fingers. He clenched his fists, vowing that they would return, that they would not be defeated by the desert or the British. They pushed forward, the German infantry surging over the British positions, their advance relentless. The soldier felt a surge of adrenaline as he charged through the smoke and dust, his senses heightened, every movement sharp and clear. He saw a British soldier rise up in front of him, his face twisted in fear and desperation. The soldier hesitated for a split second, then pulled the trigger, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. The man crumpled to the ground, the sound of his body hitting the sand almost drowned out by the roar of battle. The fighting was fierce, the British determined to hold their ground. The soldier's world narrowed to the immediate struggle, the need to survive. He fired again and again, his rifle bucking against his shoulder, his hands numb from the recoil. He saw men fall, heard the cries of the wounded, the shouts of the dying. And then, suddenly it was over. The British line broke, the defenders retreating in disarray. The soldier staggered to his feet, his body aching, his mind numb. He glanced around at his comrades, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They had taken the ridges, secured the flank. The town of Agedabia lay ahead, the prize within their grasp. January 1942, near the coastal town of Agedabia, Libya, the cold wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the fine, stinging sand that seemed to get everywhere into their uniforms, their eyes, their mouths. The soldier crouched behind the rocky outcrop, his hands numb and shaking as he adjusted the sights on his rifle. The harsh sun had given way to an icy chill as night fell over the barren landscape, the temperature dropping rapidly. The desert, with its cruel extremes, was a foe all on its own, indifferent to the men who fought and bled on its unforgiving sands. They pressed on, pushing south along the coastal road, the British rearguard fighting a desperate delaying action. The soldier's body ached with exhaustion, his mouth dry and parched. But there was no stopping now. The chase was on, and they would not let up until the British were driven from the field. The signal came at dawn. The German artillery opened up, the shells screaming overhead as they slammed into the British positions. The soldiers' ears rang from the blast as they charged forward, their boots kicking up clouds of sand. The British returned fire, their guns spitting flame and smoke, but the Germans pressed on, their advance relentless. The operation was set to begin at dawn, the darkness providing cover for their initial movements. The soldier's heart raced as he checked his equipment one last time, the anticipation almost unbearable. He knew what was at stake. The British were well dug in, their defenses strong and their resolve unyielding. But Rommel's plan was audacious, a series of feints and maneuvers designed to lure the enemy into a trap, then strike hard and fast, cutting them off from their supply lines and forcing them into a desperate retreat. They reached the ridges, the soldier dropping to the ground, his rifle raised. He fired at a British position, the bullets kicking up dust as they struck the sandbags. The enemy replied with a burst of machine gun fire, the round zipping past his head, forcing him to duck. He saw his sergeant go down, a bullet catching him in the shoulder, blood staining his uniform. The soldier crawled over, grabbing the man by the collar, dragging him back to cover. They had survived, but for how long? The soldiers stared out at the barren landscape, the endless dunes stretching to the horizon. The desert was a cruel, unforgiving place, and the British, realizing they were outflanked, began to retreat, their vehicles tearing up the desert as they fled southward. The soldier watched as they disappeared into the distance, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. They had done it. They had broken through the British lines, forced them to retreat. But there was no time to celebrate. Rommel's orders were clear: pursue the enemy, harry their retreat, give them no chance to regroup. The desert fox strikes back. As they advanced, the landscape changed, the rocky terrain giving way to endless stretches of sand dunes. The heat was oppressive, the sun beating down mercilessly, sapping their strength. The soldier wiped the sweat from his brow, his uniform sticking to his skin. He glanced at his comrades, their faces grim and determined. They had come so far, endured so much. They would see this through, no matter the cost. He peered out from his position, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. In the distance, he could see the faint glimmer of enemy headlights moving cautiously along the coastal road. British reinforcements, no doubt. They were always probing, always testing the German lines, searching for a weak spot. But tonight, it would be different. Tonight, the hunter would become the hunted. The soldier tightened his grip on his rifle, his nerves on edge. He had been assigned to a reconnaissance unit, tasked with scouting the British positions and relaying the information back to headquarters. It was dangerous work, requiring them to move quickly and quietly through enemy-held territory, but it was also crucial to the success of the operation. Every piece of information, every detail they could gather, could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Word had spread quickly through the ranks. Rommel was planning a counteroffensive, a lightning strike to push the British back and regain the ground they had lost. The soldiers' spirits lifted at the thought. They had been on the defensive for too long, pinned down by the relentless British attacks. But now, it was their turn. The Desert Fox, as Rommel was known, had devised a daring plan to outflank the British and cut off their supply lines. It was risky, but that was Rommel's way: bold, unpredictable, always striking where they least expected. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the order came. They moved out silently, their boots crunching softly on the rocky ground. The soldiers' breath fogged in the cold air as they advanced, slipping through the shadows, their eyes peeled for any sign of the enemy. They reached a ridge overlooking the British positions and crouched low, watching as the enemy soldiers went about their morning routines, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon them. The attack began with a thunderous roar. German artillery opened up from their concealed positions, the ground shaking with the force of the explosions. The soldier watched as the British positions erupted in flames and smoke, the defenders scrambling for cover as shells rained down on them. He felt a grim satisfaction as he saw the chaos below. The tables had turned, and now it was the British who were caught off guard, their lines crumbling under the ferocious bombardment. They received the order to advance, and the soldier's heart pounded as he rose to his feet, his rifle at the ready. They moved quickly down the slope, weaving through the rocky terrain, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air. The British were still reeling from the initial assault, their response disorganized and sporadic. The soldier fired at a group of figures silhouetted against the smoke, his shots cracking through the chaos. He saw one of them drop, the others diving for cover behind a shattered truck. They reached the first of the British bunkers, a low, sandbagged structure partially hidden among the rocks. The soldier and his comrades threw grenades inside, the blast sending up plumes of smoke and debris. He could hear the shouts and cries of the men inside, then silence. They moved on, leaving the wreckage behind, their focus on the next objective. The fighting was fierce and brutal, the British putting up a stubborn resistance despite the onslaught. The soldier lost track of time, his world narrowing to the immediate struggle, the need to survive. He ducked behind a rock as a burst of machine gun fire stitched the ground around him, the bullets kicking up sprays of sand. He fired back, his shots forcing the gunner to take cover, then moved forward, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the outskirts of Agedabia, the town little more than a collection of low, whitewashed buildings surrounded by barren desert. The British had set up a defensive perimeter, their tanks and artillery positioned to cover the main road. It was a formidable obstacle, but Rommel was undeterred. The attack would go ahead, a coordinated assault designed to punch through the British defenses and take the town. They reached the outskirts of the British camp, a sprawling collection of tents and vehicles hastily thrown together. The soldiers' unit spread out, fanning through the camp, flushing out the defenders. He kicked open the flap of a tent, his rifle raised, only to find it empty, the contents scattered in disarray. He turned and ran to join his comrades, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite. The soldiers' unit was assigned to the right flank, their objective a series of low ridges overlooking the road. They moved out under the cover of darkness, the sky above a blanket of stars. The soldiers' heart raced as they crept through the dunes, the sand shifting underfoot, their weapons held ready. The tension was palpable, the anticipation almost unbearable. But as they moved forward, the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The desert was vast, the war far from over. They had won this battle, but what of the next? And the one after that? He felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of foreboding that lingered even as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the sand.